There is a grain of spice somewhere in the known universe that has never been taxed, never logged, never weighed, never blessed by a guild accountant or pressed with the seal of House Carino. It moved in the dark, passed through calloused hands that the Imperium does not officially acknowledge exist, traded for water in a cavern so deep beneath the surface of Arrakis that even the sand does not know it is there. Welcome to the shadow economy of Arrakis. Welcome to the world of black market melange. To understand the smuggler networks of the Dune universe, you have to first understand what made them not just possible, but inevitable. The Imperium was built on monopoly. The Spacing Guild held an absolute stranglehold on all interstellar travel. The CHOAM Corporation controlled the distribution of every meaningful commodity across thousands of worlds. And at the center of all of it, more valuable than any currency, more strategically vital than any army, was the spice melange. A single substance found on a single planet that enabled everything the civilized galaxy depended upon. Navigation, extended life, heightened consciousness, the slow seep of power across 10,000 years of human history. When you build an economy on a single choke point like that, you do not create stability, you create pressure. And pressure in the desert always finds a way out. Now, to understand the mechanics of how the shadow economy actually functioned, we need to begin not on the surface of Arrakis, but in the void between stars. We need to begin with what the smugglers called the silent highliners. The Spacing Guild did not simply transport cargo across the universe. It held something more fundamental than a commercial monopoly. It held a conceptual one. The idea that travel between stars without a guild navigator was not merely illegal, but impossible. That belief was the guild's greatest weapon, and like most beliefs held at the scale of an empire, it was not entirely true. Guild navigators, mutated by generations of spice immersion, folded space using prescient calculation. Their minds, saturated with melange, could perceive safe passages through the infinite variables of interstellar travel. Without that ability, a ship that attempted to fold space was gambling against odds so catastrophic that most pilots refused to even speak the mathematics aloud. The probability of emerging inside a star, or dispersed across the quantum fabric of real space, or simply never emerging at all, was high enough to make the venture seem suicidal. And yet, smugglers did it. Not blindly, not recklessly, at least not all of them. The smuggler networks that developed around Arrakis over the centuries before Paul Atreides arrived on that planet had accumulated something precious: empirical data. Hundreds of unlicensed runs, the majority of which ended in catastrophe, but enough of which survived to produce what the deep desert traders called the unlicensed charts. These were not the elegant navigational mathematics of a guild steersman. They were something rougher and stranger. Accumulated survivor knowledge, routes that had been traveled more than once without total atomic disintegration, corridors in fold space where the variables, through repeated observation and an enormous amount of luck, had stabilized into something approaching predictability. The pilots who flew these routes were called fold walkers in some of the supplementary records, or sometimes just ghost runners, men and women who had traded their certainty of survival for the one thing the guild charged too much for: independence. They accepted that every jump carried a percentage chance of annihilation. Most of them dealt with this fact the way soldiers deal with the probability of a bullet, by not thinking about it too carefully and by making sure the payment was large enough to justify the math. The economics that drove this trade were grimly straightforward. Guild transit fees were set at a level that systematically excluded the small operator. The great houses could afford them. CHOAM subsidiaries could afford them. A renegade spice runner carrying a few hundred kilograms of off-book melange absolutely could not. The guild's fee structure was not accidental. It was designed to make independent commerce impossible, which meant it was also designed to create a class of merchants who had nothing to lose by going around it. When a fold walker made a successful unlicensed jump, the cargo they carried arrived in the destination system at a satellite way station rather than an official guild-controlled port. These way stations were among the most carefully kept secrets in the shadow economy. Constructed from the salvaged hulls of decommissioned freighters, asteroid mining platforms, and in at least a few documented cases, the stripped carcasses of genuine guild highliners that had met catastrophic ends. These structures existed in orbital positions that the official charts simply did not acknowledge. They floated in gravitational shadows, in the resonance points between moons, in the dead zones behind gas giants, where sensor sweeps produced interference patterns that smugglers had learned to exploit across generations. A successful run from Arrakis to one of these way stations might carry a cargo worth 10 times its weight in Solari on the official market, and significantly more than that in the places where official markets did not reach. The buyers waiting at the other end were not criminals in any simple sense. They were pharmaceuticists on Riches who needed steady Melange supply for geriatric treatments that the Spacing Guild had priced out of reach for their clients. They were researchers on Ix whose consciousness expansion programs required spice in quantities that an official CHOAM contract would have made politically impossible. They were agents of great houses who needed reserves that did not appear in any ledger that the Emperor's auditors might one day examine. The demand was real, broad, and persistent. And the shadow economy existed because demand at that scale does not simply disappear because a monopoly makes it inconvenient. But the void between stars was only one dimension of the shadow network. To understand its true anatomy, you need to descend. Not to the cities of Arrakis or Carthage, not to the polished corridors where house officials and CHOAM representatives made their public arrangements, but downward into what the Fremen called the veins of the deep desert. Arrakis was not simply a surface, it had depth. The geological history of CH and the surrounding territory stretched back hundreds of millions of years, long before the sandworms had transformed it into the ecological engine that produced Melange. Beneath the shifting dunes lay a stratigraphy of ancient rock formations, dried riverbeds from an era when the planet held water at its surface, lava tube networks from volcanic activity that had quieted long before recorded human history arrived on Arrakis. The Fremen had always known these formations existed. They had mapped them over generations, walking passages that no Imperial survey had ever reached, maintaining them as the logistical skeleton of their CH civilization. What the smuggler networks discovered, and what represents one of the most significant and underappreciated chapters of pre-Muad'Dib history, was that these same formations could serve an entirely different function. The deep desert cavern systems became the primary distribution arteries of the black market melange trade. Think about what that required in practical terms. A harvester operating on the surface of Arrakis was visible. The moment one of those massive machines bit into the sand and began pulling spice from the substrate, it was producing sensor signatures that the Imperial monitoring systems were specifically designed to detect. The Emperor's spy scouts, the Guild observers, and CHOAM's own field agents all maintained eyes on the surface in overlapping layers of surveillance. Getting Melange off a harvester and away from the eyes of that monitoring apparatus required an infrastructure that existed somewhere the sensors did not reach. The cavern networks solved this problem with elegant simplicity. Renegade operators, many of them former Fremen, or people with deep Fremen connections, had spent years identifying the points where surface geology opened into underground passage. They had mapped access points disguised as nothing more than wind-eroded rock formations, indistinguishable from the 10,000 other formations that patterned the deep desert. A surface harvester operating under smuggler contract would collect its melange in a standard fashion, running the genuine CHOAM paperwork on perhaps 60 or 70% of its haul, then diverting the remainder through a pre-arranged sequence. A mechanical failure that required the machine to park in a specific location. A maintenance window that coincided with a shift change among the Imperial overseers. A series of mundane events that, taken individually, would raise no suspicion, but that together created a window of perhaps 20 minutes during which hundreds of kilograms of unregistered spice could move from the surface machinery into an access shaft and disappear from the visible world entirely. The irony is that the Imperial monitoring system's very sophistication created the weakness the smugglers exploited. Because the sensors were calibrated to detect spice on the surface, what happened beneath the surface was functionally invisible. The Imperium had built its surveillance architecture around the assumption that no one could operate at significant scale in the deep desert without surface infrastructure. The Fremen had been demonstrating the falseness of that assumption for centuries, and the smugglers who worked with them inherited that same invisibility. Once in the cavern system, Melange stockpiles could be maintained in conditions that were, in their own way, ideal. The deep formations provided natural insulation against the temperature extremes that degraded spice quality on the surface. Geological rifts that dropped hundreds of meters into the bedrock created storage environments where the ambient moisture and temperature remained stable across seasons. Some of these hidden caches, identified in the historical record through references in Fremen oral tradition and later in the recovered notes of smuggler operatives, contained stockpiles estimated in the tens of thousands of kilograms. Quantities large enough to meaningfully affect the official market price if they had ever surfaced at once, which was precisely why they never did. The cavern networks were not only storage, they were inhabited. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and least examined aspects of the shadow economy, the question of how people survived in them. Life in the deep desert, away from the CHs and away from the cities, required solving a problem that shaped every aspect of Arrakeen civilization: water. The Fremen had built their entire culture around moisture conservation. The stillsuit was not simply a piece of technology. It was a philosophical statement about the value of what a human body contained and the absolute obligation not to waste it. But the stillsuits used by the Fremen were also the product of centuries of refinement, calibrated to Fremen physiology, maintained by Fremen artisans who had inherited their craft through generations of necessity. For the city-born outcasts and renegade operators who made up a significant portion of the deep desert smuggler population, access to that technology was not guaranteed. And so a black market for it developed. The trade in modified stillsuits and illegal water reclamation technology was, in terms of volume and number of transactions, almost certainly larger than the spice trade it enabled. Because every person who operated in the shadow economy needed water technology to survive, while only certain nodes in the network actually handled melange. A renegade pilot on a way station needed reclaimed water. A mule operator moving cargo through the cavern system needed a functional stillsuit. A broker running a hidden cache outpost needed atmospheric moisture traps capable of pulling enough water from even the savage dryness of the Arrakeen deep desert to sustain a small team. The moisture trap technology that appeared in the shadow economy was a remarkable hybrid. It drew on Fremen atmospheric collection techniques that had been developed over thousands of years of desert habitation, but modified by renegade technicians who had access to off-world materials and different engineering traditions. Where a standard Fremen wind trap was built from local geology and carefully maintained by CHs that could afford the labor investment, the outlaw versions were faster to construct, more portable, and optimized for rapid deployment in geological formations. The Fremen themselves might not have considered ideal. They were less efficient per unit of water collected, but they could be assembled by a small team without specialized knowledge, moved if the location became compromised, and abandoned without significant loss if Imperial forces swept through an area. These moisture trap outposts became the nervous system of the deep desert operation. Each one represented a safe harbor, a place where a runner moving cargo through the underground network could resupply, rest, and receive updated intelligence about route conditions. They were spaced at intervals, calibrated to the water-carrying capacity of a person in a functional stillsuit, moving at sustainable pace, which gives you a sense of how carefully the entire infrastructure had been thought through. This was not improvised crime. This was logistics. Deliberate, sophisticated, multi-generational logistics, operated by people whose lives depended on getting the details right. Water, in this context, functioned as something more than a survival resource. It functioned as currency. The Solari, the official currency of the Imperium, was useful in cities and in the formal economy. But in the deep desert, among the networks of outcasts and renegades and Fremen-adjacent operators who ran the shadow trade, a Solari note had no purchasing power at all. You could not drink a Solari. You could not maintain a stillsuit with it. You could not barter it for passage through a route controlled by people who had no access to and no interest in official financial systems. Water was stable, universally demanded, and its value in the desert context was not subject to the political fluctuations that could make official currency unreliable. When the emperor imposed trade sanctions on a house, solari values shifted. When a CHOAM contract was restructured, commodity prices moved in ways that rippled through every connected market. None of that affected the price of water in a cavern 300 meters below the Arrakis surface. A liter of clean water was worth approximately the same in terms of what it could purchase from a willing desert operator, whether House Atreides or House Harkonnen controlled the surface above. The shadow economy had entirely organically created a monetary system that was immune to the political instabilities of the official one. To keep this entire apparatus functioning required a class of people who rarely appear in the histories of the Imperium, but who were, in many ways, its most essential practitioners. The renegade technicians. The deep desert shadow economy ran on machinery. Harvesters, reclamation units, atmospheric collectors, communication relays, the sensor jamming equipment that kept the cavern operations invisible to Imperial survey, the modified vessels that ran the unlicensed fold space routes. All of it broke down. All of it required maintenance by people who understood how it worked and had access to the parts and tools needed to keep it operational. In the official economy, that function was performed by certified guild mechanics or CHOAM licensed engineering firms. In the shadow economy, it was performed by individuals who had typically been trained in those official contexts, then left them voluntarily or otherwise. The profile of a renegade technician, assembled from the scattered references in historical records and from accounts preserved in the Fremen oral tradition, was consistent. A person with deep, formal technical training, usually from Ix or from one of the other industrially sophisticated worlds of the Landsraad. A background that included a formal career that had ended badly through disgrace, debt, political misfortune, or in some cases simply through the discovery that the official economy paid poorly and the shadow economy paid very well for the same skills. And a willingness to work without the institutional support systems that official technicians depended on, improvising solutions with available materials rather than waiting for certified parts through proper supply chains. The strip mining of abandoned harvester machinery was a particular specialty. When a harvester was officially decommissioned on Arrakis, the official process involved cataloging its components, recovering the most valuable systems through licensed salvage contractors, and disposing of the remainder in designated areas. The shadow economy had a different process. Renegade operators would reach a machine before the official salvage teams, or sometimes in parallel with them, and systematically remove every component with black market value. Drive systems, reclamation modules, sensor arrays, the high output power cells that could be adapted to run almost any piece of shadow economy equipment. A single abandoned crawler, stripped efficiently by a team that knew what it was doing, could supply enough parts to keep 3 or 4 shadow outposts running for a standard year. There is something almost elegiac about that image. The enormous abandoned harvesters of Arrakis, the machines that had pulled billions of solari worth of spice from the planet's surface for the official economy, being quietly disassembled in the dark to keep alive the shadow economy that the official one had tried to exclude, the machinery of monopoly being recycled into the infrastructure of its own subversion. Now we come to the part of the story that the official histories of the Landsraad most strenuously avoid. The part that implicates not outcasts and renegades, but the highest levels of imperial aristocracy. Because the shadow economy of Arrakis did not survive and grow for centuries on the basis of desperate desert operators alone. It survived because the great houses needed it. Let us be precise about what that means. A great house of the Landsraad operated within an official economic structure that was by design constrictive. CHOAM controlled the spice distribution contracts. The emperor controlled the CHOAM directorship. A house's official spice allocation was therefore a political instrument as much as a commercial one, subject to revision, suspension, or outright revocation based on its standing with House Carino and its alignment with the interests of the other powerful houses. For any house that found itself in a politically uncertain position, which, given the perpetual scheming of Landsraad politics, was effectively all of them at various points, relying entirely on official spice allocation was a vulnerability so obvious that ignoring it would have been negligence. The solution that most great houses arrived at was structurally identical, even if each one believed its own. Arrangement was unique and deniable. They needed off-book spice reserves, stockpiles of melange that did not appear in any CHOAM ledger or imperial tax record, that could not be seized by the emperor as part of a political sanction, that could be sold or used as leverage in negotiations that needed to remain invisible to the official record. And the only way to build those reserves was through the shadow economy. The mechanics of how this worked required several layers of insulation between the house treasury and the actual smuggler transaction. No senior house official would communicate directly with a deep desert operator. The chain typically ran through intermediaries who could plausibly be described as independent commercial agents, or through legitimate subsidiary businesses whose financial records were opaque enough to absorb irregular cash flows without obvious explanation. A house might, for example, maintain a series of contracts with small-scale Arrakis commercial firms that collectively served as fronts, routing payments to shadow network brokers, and receiving shipments that passed through enough hands to have lost any clear traceable origin by the time they arrived at a house storehouse on another planet. The scale of this hidden commerce, when you begin to aggregate the evidence, is genuinely staggering. Some estimates, drawn from the fragmentary financial records that survived the political upheavals following Paul's rise, suggest that as much as 30% of total Arrakis spice production never passed through official CHOAM accounting at any point in its journey from the sand to a great house reserve. 30%. On a substance that was the single most economically significant commodity in the known universe. The shadow economy was not a marginal footnote to the official one. It was structurally integral to it. The system of kickbacks that kept this arrangement stable was its own art form. Imperial tax collectors assigned to Arrakis were not naive. Many of them understood, at some level, that the numbers they were receiving from official sources did not account for the full economic reality of the planet's output. What prevented them from pressing the matter was a series of arrangements that fell just short of direct bribery, that occupied the careful space between what could be proved and what everyone involved understood to be true. A tax official who performed their duties without excessive enthusiasm might find that their next posting was a comfortable one. A CHOAM audit team that concluded its review of a particular distribution node without flagging certain irregularities might find that the consulting fees for their next private sector engagement were generous. The Imperium ran on patronage, and patronage was simply corruption with better tailoring. What makes this particularly fascinating is the profile of the officials who participated in the condemnation of the shadow economy while privately depending on it. Senior members of the Landsraad who made impassioned speeches about the integrity of the spice monopoly, about the threat that black market commerce posed to imperial stability, about the urgent necessity of crushing the smuggler networks with Sardaukar force. These same individuals were often maintaining off-book reserves that had been sourced through exactly those networks. The hypocrisy was not individual moral failure. It was systemic. The official economy required the Shadow One to function, and the Shadow One required the official condemnation to maintain the fiction that kept the overall arrangement politically stable. The enforcement mechanisms that were officially tasked with destroying the shadow economy deserve their own examination, because the story of how those mechanisms actually functioned tells you everything about why the black market persisted. The Sardaukar were the Emperor's terror troops. Fanatical, supremely trained, brutal in their methods, they were deployed against smuggler networks periodically and with evident intent to destroy. And in terms of individual operations, they were often successful. A Sardaukar sweep through a known cavern network could neutralize an established route, scatter its operators, and seize or destroy cached melange in quantities significant enough to briefly move the black market price. But they could not eliminate the network itself, and there were reasons for this that went beyond the tactical. The first reason was geographic. Arrakis was enormous, geologically complex, and had been inhabited by the Fremen for long enough that the underground infrastructure extended far beyond what any surface-based intelligence operation could fully map. Destroying one node of the cavern network simply caused traffic to reroute through adjacent passages. Eliminating a way station in a particular orbital position caused the trade to shift to a different gravitational shadow. The infrastructure was redundant by design, because the people who built it had been responding to exactly this kind of pressure for generations. The second reason was informational. The Sardaukar depended on intelligence, and intelligence about the shadow economy flowed through official channels that were, as we have established, systematically compromised by the same great houses that funded the black market. When a Sardaukar commander received a briefing on the location of a major smuggler hub, the information that briefing contained had passed through multiple hands, any one of which might have a financial interest in ensuring that the most inconvenient details arrived too late or too vague to be actionable. The shadow network had, in effect, colonized the intelligence apparatus that was supposed to be hunting it. The third reason, and the one that the Emperor himself could not acknowledge without undermining his own position, was that the shadow market served a function that the official economy genuinely could not perform. The official spice market was structured around the interests of the very largest players. It was optimized for the great houses, for CHOAM, for the guild. It could not efficiently serve the thousands of smaller consumers across the Imperium who needed melange in quantities too small to make an official CHOAM contract worthwhile at prices low enough to actually purchase it. The shadow market served all of those needs. It was, in economic terms, the pressure valve of the entire system, distributing the commodity more broadly than the official structure would allow, and in doing so, preventing the kind of acute shortage in secondary markets that might have destabilized the political order from below rather than from above. A monopoly that cannot serve its own market is a monopoly that creates the conditions for its own destruction. The Emperor understood this at some level, which is why the Sardaukar sweeps were periodic rather than sustained, calibrated to visible disruption rather than actual eradication. The goal was never to truly destroy the shadow network. The goal was to be seen trying to maintain the political fiction of monopoly enforcement while allowing the functional reality of black market commerce to continue performing its necessary role. And then something shifted. The balance that had held for centuries, the careful equilibrium between official suppression and functional tolerance, began to break down in the decades before Paul Atreides arrived on Arrakis. The shadow networks had been growing more sophisticated with each generation. The accumulation of unlicensed navigational data, the expanding map of underground infrastructure, the increasing capability of renegade technicians who had now been practicing their craft across multiple generations, all of it represented a compounding of capability that the official economy's surveillance apparatus had not kept pace with. By the time House Atreides received the fief of Arrakis from the Emperor's hand, the smuggler syndicates operating in and around Arrakeen space were not the desperate fringe operators of an earlier era. They were organized, well-armed, and in possession of logistical capabilities that in certain specific domains exceeded those of the official economy they paralleled. The escalating tension between Sardaukar enforcement and the smuggler syndicates had begun producing incidents that could not be diplomatically managed as quietly as earlier confrontations had been. Armed confrontations in orbital space near the hidden way stations. Firefights in cavern systems when Imperial teams had better intelligence than usual, or when smuggler security had been negligent. The occasional disappearance of an Imperial official who had been too openly pursuing lines of inquiry that certain Great House agents found inconvenient. What this escalation represented, in the language of systems analysis, was a pressure buildup. The shadow economy had grown to a scale where the official economy could no longer comfortably pretend it did not exist. The fiction of the monopoly was developing cracks that were becoming visible to too many people at once. And a system under that kind of pressure does one of two things. It finds a new equilibrium, or it breaks. The arrival of Paul Atreides on Arrakis and the catastrophic political reorganization that followed created conditions unlike anything the Shadow Networks had been designed to navigate. The Harkonnen restoration under Imperial backing, the near destruction of House Atreides, and then Paul's transformation from refugee to Muad'Dib, and then to Emperor, created a period of such acute instability that the conventional smuggler networks operating around Arrakis fragmented almost entirely. But here is what the histories of that period tend to underemphasize. The infrastructure survived, the cavern systems remained, the unlicensed charts persisted in the mines and encoded files of surviving foldwalkers. The Renegade technicians scattered but did not disappear. The shadow economy had proven, over centuries of operating against the most powerful monopoly in human history, that it was more durable than the political structures arrayed against it. It had demonstrated that a sufficiently distributed, sufficiently adaptive economic network cannot be destroyed by even a hostile empire that is actively trying. It can only be disrupted temporarily before finding new form. Paul's own Jihad, spreading across 10,000 worlds with a ferocity that reshaped the demographic and political map of the Imperium, did not end the need for the shadow economy. It transformed it. In the period immediately following Paul's ascension to the throne and the consolidation of his control over Arrakis, the official spice monopoly was reconcentrated in ways that made the Carino version look liberal by comparison. The new imperial control was tighter, more absolute, more directly maintained by force, that made the Sardaukar look gentle. And tight monopolies, as the history of Arrakis had so consistently demonstrated, produce shadow economies with the same inevitability that desert produces sand. The black market melange trade did not end with Paul. It did not end with Leto II and the God Emperor's 4,000-year reign, during which his own monopoly over spice reached levels of absolute control that no previous ruler had approached. It persisted, evolved, adapted, and continued to perform its fundamental economic function, which was to distribute what the official system could not, to serve the demand that the monopoly could not acknowledge, and to remind the Imperium, in the language of commerce rather than politics, that no concentration of power over a necessary resource is ever truly absolute. The great lesson of the Arrakeen shadow economy is not about spice. It is not even really about the desert, though the desert gave it its particular character and its particular resilience. The lesson is about what happens when a system of power tries to make itself the only answer to a question that many different people are asking. The shadow market existed because human need does not wait for official permission, because the people the Imperium had excluded from its formal arrangements did not disappear. They organized, they innovated, they built, beneath the notice of the official world, an entire parallel civilization with its own currency, its own logistics, its own ethics, and its own economy of survival. The smugglers of Arrakis were not romantic outlaws in any simple sense. Many of them were brutal, pragmatic, and entirely willing to let the violence required to maintain their operations fall on people with less power than themselves. But they were also the proof of something the Padishah emperors and the CHOAM directors and the guild navigators in their tanks of spice-saturated gas were never quite able to accept. That the desire for freedom from a monopoly is not a crime that can be suppressed. It is a force that can only be redirected, and a force that, in the long history of Arrakis, always found a way to flow. Somewhere in the deep desert, beneath the shifting dunes and the sensor sweeps and the 1,000-year arguments about who controls what, there is still a grain of spice that has never been taxed, still moving through the dark in calloused hands, still finding its way to someone who needs it through routes that no official chart acknowledges, still reminding the universe in the quietest possible way that the shadow economy is not the shadow of anything. It is the thing itself. It is the real economy, the one that persists when everything built on top of it finally crumbles back into the sand.